She held newborns with practiced tenderness, tucked them into warm blankets, smiled at anxious mothers. She was the nurse you hoped would be on duty when your baby cried in the middle of the night. Brenda Cecilia Agüero looked like a guardian in scrubs. But something inside the neonatal unit at Ramon Carrillo Hospital in Córdoba, Argentina, something almost imperceptible, was beginning to unravel. Between March and June of 2022, 5 infants died under mysterious circumstances. No prior health risks, no infections, just sudden collapses, cardiac arrests in otherwise stable newborns. Their hearts stopped. No one could explain why. The parents were told it was nature, fragility, a tragic mystery. But behind the monitors and sterile lighting, something else was happening. Brenda was always there when the alarms went off. She was the one holding the chart, administering the medication, documenting the final moments. She had answers, too quickly. She stayed calm, too easily, and one by one, babies stopped breathing. Doctors began to whisper. One noticed potassium levels so high they were incompatible with life. Another found insulin traces in an infant that had never needed glucose regulation. The numbers didn't match the medical history, and yet no autopsies were ordered. No warnings were filed, because who would suspect a smiling nurse in a neonatal ward? But patterns don't stay hidden forever. And in this episode of Criminal Psychology Unmasked, we enter one of the most horrifying medical crimes in Latin America. A case not just of murder, but of betrayal, of silence, and of a woman who turned her access to life into calculated death. Before we move further into this story, take a second to make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. It's what keeps this space alive. A place where we don't just describe the crime, we examine the mind that chose to commit it. Because the walls of that neonatal unit didn't just echo with newborn cries, they concealed a pattern, and it began where comfort was supposed to live. Neonatal wards are meant to be sanctuaries, quiet, sterile, and filled with tiny flickering hopes. Parents visit in hushed voices, nurses move gently between incubators, and every beep on a monitor holds the weight of a heartbeat too small to defend itself. At Ramon Carrillo Hospital, the neonatal unit was no different. At least, it didn't appear to be. It was clean, modern, staffed with trained professionals. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The nursery wasn't just witnessing death, it was absorbing it. Over 3 months in 2022, the number of cardiac arrests among newborns quietly crept upward. No alarms were raised publicly, no press releases. Just quiet funerals, one after another. Brenda Agüero had been working there since 2020. She wasn't new, she was trusted. Her name appeared often on shift rotations during critical nights. And when babies died, she was always the one who knew how to handle the parents, how to console them, how to fill in the paperwork with calm, practiced language. It didn't seem suspicious at first. The hospital itself didn't want panic. Deaths in a neonatal ICU weren't unheard of. Complications happen, premature lungs, weak hearts, infections. But the deaths that began stacking up didn't fit those profiles. The babies were full term. Their charts were stable until suddenly they weren't. Still, no one spoke out. Whispers began, but stayed inside staff lounges. Nurses wondered why some incubators went quiet during Brenda's shifts. A pediatrician noted that all 5 babies who died had shown no signs of deterioration until minutes before death. But there were no bruises, no bleeding, no struggling. Because the damage wasn't physical, it was chemical. And the nursery, a place built for first breaths, had become a space where something invisible was stealing life, silently and precisely. There was no screaming, no alarms that rang in time, just silence, followed by chaos. Brenda Agüero's method wasn't loud or clumsy. It didn't leave bruises. It didn't trigger suspicion immediately. That's what made it so deadly. The babies she targeted were not terminal. They weren't gasping for air or slipping into septic shock. They were stable, sleeping, growing until something invisible was introduced into their bloodstream. What investigators later found was chilling. In several cases, potassium levels in the blood of the deceased were so high they were classified as incompatible with life. One reading showed 11.9 micol, double the maximum level for a newborn. In others, insulin was found in babies who had no history of glucose regulation issues. The result, sudden cardiac arrest or hypoglycemic coma. Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. Potassium, in small doses, is used in controlled neonatal care. But in overdose, it shuts down the heart muscle with frightening efficiency. It mimics natural failure. It leaves no visible trace. Insulin in excess drops blood sugar levels dangerously. But in a neonatal ICU, where feeding is monitored and variables abound, hypoglycemia isn't immediately suspicious. She was injecting lethal substances into the most fragile bodies on Earth and counting on the chaos of the ICU to mask her trail. Her knowledge of dosages, timing, and procedures wasn't accidental. It was learned, applied, rehearsed. She had access, she had skill, and more importantly, she had trust. By the time patterns started to emerge, it was already too late. 5 babies were gone. Others had barely survived resuscitation, and still, no one had seen her do it. Because what Brenda left behind wasn't a weapon, it was absence. Patterns don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper, through numbers, through timing, through instinct. And in the neonatal unit of Ramon Carrillo Hospital, the whispers began to gather weight. It started with a nurse reviewing shift reports. She noticed that Brenda Agüero had been present during every unexpected cardiac arrest since March. Then a pediatrician, looking back at records, saw that all 5 fatal cases occurred on Brenda's night shifts. Not some, not most, all. The same nurse, the same quiet hallway, the same sudden silence. What's more, the babies had been doing well just hours before. Notes written by other staff described them as stable, active, feeding without issue. But something always changed after Brenda's rounds. Still, no one wanted to believe it. How do you accuse someone like Brenda? She was kind, polite. She remembered birthdays. She helped cover shifts when others were tired. She even cried at the funerals, or at least she looked like she did. But the numbers kept circling back to her. When administrators finally requested a full incident review, they cross-referenced deaths, medication access logs, and timestamps from security cameras. The result, an undeniable correlation. Brenda had been the last nurse to touch each of the 5 infants. In some cases, medication records had gaps. In others, entries were made after the time of death. What emerged wasn't just a suspicion, it was a pattern, cold, deliberate, repetitive, one that hid behind routine, one that weaponized trust, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. That's when Brenda's mask, the professional, the caregiver, the good nurse, began to loosen, and something darker began to surface. Hospitals are built on protocols, but they survive on trust. The trust between families and staff, between doctors and nurses, between life and the thin layer of order that holds it together. At Ramon Carrillo Hospital, that trust had begun to rot long before the investigation went public. Administrators received internal warnings as early as May 2022 after the 3rd unexplained neonatal death. Some staff raised concerns privately, others asked for autopsies or clinical reviews, but the response was slow, dismissive, defensive. The hospital didn't want scandal. It didn't want headlines that questioned the safety of its neonatal ward, so instead of sounding the alarm, it doubled down on silence. Brenda Agüero remained on staff. She continued her shifts, continued accessing medication carts, continued working alone at night. Some deaths weren't even reported to provincial health authorities until weeks later. By then, 2 more infants had died, and the pattern, which could have been broken, was allowed to complete itself. When journalists finally got hold of the story, what emerged wasn't just a case of serial killing. It was a system that allowed it to happen, a silence that protected the wrong person. Several hospital officials are now facing charges of negligence, obstruction of justice, and falsification of records. Their defense? They didn't know what was happening, but that's not entirely true. They just didn't want to believe it. And in that gap, between doubt and denial, more lives were lost. Because while Brenda planned her acts alone, she didn't act in a vacuum. She operated inside a system that looked the other way. And that makes the story of this crime not just about one woman, but about everyone who kept the door closed while she did what she came to do. August 25th, 2022. Brenda Agüero arrived for her usual shift at the neonatal unit, unaware that this night would be her last as a nurse. By then, the hospital had quietly submitted evidence to the provincial authorities. Toxicology reports, shift records, camera footage. What investigators found drew a single, unmistakable line through every infant death. At 8:45 p.m., while Brenda reviewed charts, plainclothes officers entered the unit. She looked up, confused, then smiled. She didn't panic, she didn't run. She even asked if they needed help. The officers asked her to step outside. In the hallway, she was informed that she was under arrest for the suspected murder of 5 infants and attempted murder of at least 8 more. The hallway, usually filled with the soft hum of machines and distant infant cries, fell into a silence heavier than death itself. Brenda's expression didn't change. No tears, no outrage, just a stunned stillness, as if the mask she had worn for so long had simply stopped fitting. She was taken into custody without resistance. Later, during interrogation, she denied everything, said she loved those babies, said she did nothing wrong, that she was being targeted for doing her job. But the evidence spoke louder. Potassium levels, insulin traces, medication access logs matching her keycard ID, medical records altered in her handwriting, and a timeline, each death falling under her care. There were no confessions, no breakdowns, just silence. A final silence from the woman who had already taken so many. And behind that silence, a mind still hidden, still unread, still dangerous. Not every killer leaves behind blood. Some leave behind silence. In the neonatal unit where first breaths were meant to be celebrated, Brenda Agüero brought absence. Tiny blankets that would never be held again. Empty cribs that no one dared to move. Parents left with no answers, only apologies written in sterile reports. And a hospital too afraid to ask the right questions until it was too late. Her trial, conviction, and diagnosis would come later. But what haunts most isn't just what she did, it's what was allowed to happen. How many staff members felt something and said nothing? How many signs were written off as coincidence? How many lives could have been saved if someone had stopped trusting her smile? This wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was a crime of routine, of access, of protection. Brenda didn't sneak in. She walked through the front door, in uniform. And that should terrify us more than any shadow in the dark. If this story stayed with you, share it. Like this video if it made you think. Subscribe to Criminal Psychology Unmasked so you never miss what lies beneath the surface. And tell me in the comments, was this the work of a cold killer or a system that refused to see what it didn't want to believe? In part 2, we go back to where it all began, into Brenda's mind, her past, and the psychological profile that stunned even seasoned experts. Thank you for staying with me this far. I'll see you in the next video.